On the morning of September 1st, 1939, German artillery opened fire on a small Polish fortress at the mouth of Danzig harbour. Simultaneously, more than 60 divisions of the Wehrmacht crossed Poland's western border along a front stretching nearly 1,800 kilometres. The Luftwaffe screamed overhead, bombing railways, command centres and retreating columns. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler stood before the Reichstag in a grey field uniform and told the assembled deputies that Germany had been attacked first. The lie was so brazen, so meticulously rehearsed, that it barely mattered. Everyone already knew the truth. The real question that has fascinated historians ever since is not whether Germany was going to start a war, but why it had to be in 1939 specifically. Why not 1940? Why not 1942, when Germany's military would have been even stronger? What forces, pressures and calculations made September 1939 the moment Germany crossed the line from which there was no return? In this video, we are going to find out. The answer reaches back 2 decades to the humiliation of a defeated nation, wins through the catastrophe of a global depression, accelerates through the dizzying gambles of the 1930s and arrives at a precise and terrifying convergence of ideology, economics, military strategy, and one man's obsessive sense of his own destiny. So without further ado, let's start at the very beginning of how Germany reached the point where it felt it had no choice but to plunge the world into war. To understand why Germany went to war in 1939, you have to understand what Germany felt had been done to it in 1919. When the guns finally fell silent in November 1918, Germany had not been invaded. No foreign army had crossed the Rhine, Berlin had not been occupied. The German army still stood in the field, deep inside France and Belgium, and yet Germany was surrendering. For millions of Germans, this made no sense at all. It seemed impossible that the army had lost a war it was still fighting. In the weeks and months that followed the armistice, a poisonous explanation began to circulate throughout German society. The army had not been defeated on the battlefield, the story went. It had been stabbed in the back by traitors at home, by socialists, by Jews, by defeatists who had undermined the war effort from within. This was the Dolchstoßlegende, the stab-in-the-back myth, and while it was historically false, it was politically irresistible. It gave a broken nation a story it could live with. It transferred blame from the generals who had actually led Germany to defeat onto convenient scapegoats who could be punished in the future. Then came Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, imposed conditions on Germany that its people regarded not merely as harsh, but as a moral atrocity. Germany was forced to accept sole responsibility for causing the war under Article 231, the infamous War Guilt Clause. This was not just a legal technicality, it was the foundation for everything else that followed. Because Germany had caused the war, Germany owed reparations to those it had harmed. The total sum eventually fixed was 132 billion gold marks, an astronomical figure that would consume German economic resources for decades. In addition, Germany lost roughly 13% of its pre-war territory. Alsace-Lorraine went back to France. North Schleswig went to Denmark. Posen and West Prussia, territories with large German populations, were handed to the newly created Polish state, slicing through German land to give Poland access to the Baltic Sea through a strip of territory that became known as the Polish Corridor. East Prussia was now geographically separated from the rest of Germany by this corridor, a wound that bled resentment continuously. The German army was reduced to a maximum of 100,000 men, with no conscription, no air force, no submarines, and no heavy artillery. The general staff was abolished. The navy was stripped to a handful of obsolete ships. Germany was to remain militarily defenseless, surrounded by nations that had beaten it, watched over by a League of Nations that Germany was initially not even allowed to join. For Germans across the political spectrum, Versailles was not a peace treaty. It was a diktat. A dictated peace imposed by victors on a helpless nation. Even Germans who supported the Weimar Republic, the new democratic government that had replaced the Kaiser's regime, called the treaty a national humiliation. The men who signed it were branded the November criminals, traitors who had surrendered what the army had not lost. This collective grievance became the defining psychological reality of German political life throughout the 1920s. Every German political party, from the far left to the far right, agreed that Versailles had to be revised. The only question was how. And into that vacuum of fury and shame stepped the political movements that would ultimately answer that question with the most devastating consequences imaginable. The Weimar Republic, Germany's first genuine attempt at parliamentary democracy, was born under impossible circumstances. It had to sign Versailles. It had to navigate the hyperinflation of 1923, when the German mark became so worthless that workers were paid twice a day and rushed to spend their wages before prices rose again, when a wheelbarrow of banknotes could not buy a loaf of bread, when the life savings of the German middle class were wiped out overnight. Those who had been careful, who had saved, who had played by the rules, found themselves destitute. Those who had debts found them dissolved. It was economically ruinous and morally disorienting. The hyperinflation created a generation of Germans who never trusted banks, governments, or financial systems again, a generation that was psychologically primed to believe that the system was rigged against them and that radical solutions were needed. The Republic stabilized in the mid-1920s with the help of American loans under the Dawes Plan of 1924 and then the Young Plan of 1929, which restructured reparations and allowed some economic recovery. There was a brief period, roughly 1924 to 1929, when the Republic seemed to be finding its footing. German culture flourished. The arts, cinema, architecture, and science experienced a remarkable explosion of creativity. But it was fragile prosperity built on borrowed money and borrowed time. Then came October 1929 and the Wall Street crash. The Great Depression that followed was catastrophic for every industrialized nation, but it struck Germany with particular ferocity. American banks, facing their own crisis, immediately called in the loans they had made to Germany under the Dawes Plan. German banks, suddenly deprived of capital, began to fail. German industry contracted violently. By the winter of 1931 to 1932, Germany had over 6 million officially unemployed workers, a figure that represented perhaps a third of the entire workforce. Many millions more were underemployed or had given up looking for work entirely. In certain industrial cities, entire neighborhoods went without heating or adequate food. The social fabric began to tear. The Weimar Republic, already mistrusted, appeared completely incapable of managing the disaster. Between 1930 and 1933, Germany had 5 different chancellors as parliamentary coalitions collapsed one after another. The communists surged in the streets and at the ballot box. The far right surged even faster. Into this perfect storm of economic despair, national humiliation, institutional failure, and ideological conflict stepped Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20, 1889, in Braunau am Inn, a small Austrian town on the border with Bavaria. His early years were marked by failure. He twice failed to gain admission to the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts and spent years as a struggling artist and drifter in Vienna and Munich, living in hostels and selling postcards. The First World War rescued him. It gave him purpose, comradeship, and a cause. He served as a corporal on the Western Front, won the Iron Cross First Class, and was devastated by Germany's defeat in 1918. The experience of losing, combined with the stab-in-the-back myth and the Versailles humiliation, fused in his mind into an apocalyptic worldview. Germany had been betrayed. The betrayers were identifiable, and only a man of absolute will, unconstrained by conventional morality, could undo what had been done. By 1919, he had joined the tiny German Workers' Party in Munich. By 1921, he had taken it over, renamed it, and begun building the organization that would eventually seize power in Germany. Hitler was an extraordinarily gifted political orator, able to channel the anger and resentment of his audiences and redirect it toward the targets. His ideology required. His speeches were not arguments. They were incantations. He spoke of blood and soil, of racial struggle and national rebirth, of a Germany that had been enslaved but would rise again. His ideology, laid out in his 1925 autobiography, Mein Kampf, was both comprehensive and barbaric. Jews were a racial enemy who had poisoned Germany from within and would continue to do so unless removed entirely. Slavic peoples were subhuman, fit only for labor and eventual displacement. Germany needed living space, Lebensraum, in the east. The agricultural lands of Poland and Russia, populated by racially inferior peoples, belonged rightfully to the German race which would colonize and develop them. These ideas were not original. Racial nationalism anti-Semitism, and expansionist fantasy had circulated in Central European politics for decades. What Hitler did was synthesize them into a coherent political program and attach that program to a mass movement at precisely the moment when millions of Germans were desperate enough to listen. The Nazi Party grew slowly through the 1920s, gaining momentum during the Depression years and surging toward electoral dominance by 1932. In the July 1932 Reichstag elections, the Nazis won 37.4% of the vote, making them by far the largest single party in parliament. Their numbers dipped slightly in November that year, but they remained the dominant political force in a splintered, failing system. Conservative politicians, notably former Chancellor Franz von Papen and President Paul von Hindenburg, believed they could control Hitler by making him Chancellor while surrounding him with establishment figures. This was one of the most catastrophic miscalculations in political history. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Within 18 months, the Weimar Republic was dead, replaced by the totalitarian state that Hitler called the Third Reich. The speed with which Hitler dismantled German democracy was breathtaking. The Reichstag fire on February 27, 1933, provided the excuse for emergency decrees that suspended civil liberties. The Enabling Act of March 23, 1933, gave Hitler's government the power to pass laws without parliamentary approval for 4 years. The political parties were dissolved or banned. Trade unions were crushed. The press was brought under Nazi control. The judiciary was subordinated to Nazi ideology. The SS, Heinrich Himmler's security organization, grew into a vast apparatus of surveillance and terror. Jews were systematically stripped of their citizenship and rights through the Nuremberg Laws of September 1935. Germany was being transformed from a republic into a racial dictatorship at a pace that left opponents reeling and intimidated before they could organize any effective resistance. But Hitler had not come to power simply to rule Germany. He had come to power to fulfill what he regarded as a historical mission. That mission, as he had described it in Mein Kampf and in countless speeches and private conversations, was to reverse the verdict of 1918, to tear up the Treaty of Versailles, to reunite all Germans in a single Reich, and ultimately to conquer living space in the East for the German people. These were not vague aspirations. Hitler believed in them with a ferocity that his generals would later describe as almost supernatural in its intensity. And from the very first days of his chancellorship, he began planning how to make them real. The question was not whether he would pursue these goals. The question was when the moment would arrive to strike and what preparations had to be made before that moment came. How did Germany build up to that inevitable confrontation? Let's look at the crucial steps. The most immediate priority for Hitler in 1933 was to rebuild German military power. The Versailles restrictions that had limited the German army to 100,000 men were a daily insult to everything he stood for. Secret rearmament had actually begun under the Weimar Republic in the late 1920s, with Germany training officers in the Soviet Union under a secret agreement that evaded Allied inspectors. But Hitler massively accelerated this process. From 1933 onward, the German government began spending on armaments at a rate that staggered economic observers. Defense spending, which stood at roughly 4% of German national income in 1933, rose to 23% by 1939. The Wehrmacht, the new German armed forces, expanded from the 100,000 men permitted by Versailles to over 1 million by 1936 and over 3 million by 1939. The Luftwaffe, the air force that Versailles had banned entirely, was announced publicly in March 1935 under the command of Hermann Göring, a Great War flying ace and one of Hitler's oldest allies. The Kriegsmarine began building submarines and warships in defiance of treaty restrictions. Hermann Göring was a key figure in this transformation. A flamboyant, corpulent man with a vast appetite for power, luxury, and morphine, Göring had joined the Nazi movement in the early 1920s after a distinguished career as a fighter ace. By 1933, he was Hitler's most powerful lieutenant. As Prussia's Minister of the Interior, he had helped dismantle democratic institutions. As Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, he built what would become one of the most formidable air forces in the world. And as plenipotentiary for the 4-year plan from 1936 onward, he oversaw Germany's transformation into a war economy. Göring was not an ideologue in the rigorous sense that Hitler was, but he was a loyal and effective executor of Hitler's will, and his energy in building German military and industrial power was genuinely formidable. The German General Staff watched all of this with complex emotions. Many senior officers were delighted to see Germany rearming and reasserting its military status. They had chafed under the Versailles restrictions for 15 years, but some were deeply uneasy about the pace. General Ludwig Beck, who served as chief of the Army General Staff from 1935 to 1938, worried that Germany was moving too fast, that the economy could not sustain the armament program indefinitely, and that a premature war would end in catastrophe. His concerns were not entirely wrong, but in the early years of the Nazi regime, Hitler's calculations appeared to be vindicated by events, and critics were sidelined or removed. On March 7, 1936, Hitler ordered German troops to march into the Rhineland, the demilitarized zone along Germany's western border that had been imposed by Versailles and the Locarno Treaties of 1925. This was the first truly decisive gamble of his career. The French army was overwhelmingly superior to the forces Germany could deploy at that moment. The German generals who advised Hitler on the operation knew that if France responded with military force, they would have to retreat immediately. The 3 battalions of infantry and small artillery units that crossed the Rhine bridges were under orders to withdraw at the first sign of French resistance. Hitler later admitted that the 48 hours following the move into the Rhineland were the most nerve-wracking of his life. He told his inner circle that if the French had marched, he would have had to pull back, and the resulting humiliation might have ended his regime. But France did not march, neither did Britain. The Western powers protested diplomatically, held urgent meetings, and ultimately did nothing. Germany occupied the Rhineland unopposed. The lesson Hitler drew from this episode shaped everything that followed. The democracies were weak. Their leaders were unwilling to risk war. They would make noise but accept facts on the ground. If Germany moved boldly and quickly, it could achieve its objectives before anyone organized a response. The Rhineland success gave Hitler a crucial strategic asset: confidence. And confidence, in politics as in warfare, has its own momentum. By 1936, Hitler had also secured a crucial international alignment. On October 25, 1936, Germany and Fascist Italy signed the Rome-Berlin Axis Agreement, a political declaration of shared interest between the two dictatorships. A month later, on November 25th, Germany and Japan signed the Anti-Comintern Pact, directed ostensibly against the Soviet Union. These agreements did not create a formal military alliance immediately, but they signaled a new international alignment that complicated the calculations of Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Germany was no longer isolated. It had partners, or at least ideological fellow travellers, who complicated the task of containing German expansion. It was also in 1936 that Hitler announced a crucial economic initiative: the 4-year plan. The plan's stated goal was to make Germany economically self-sufficient and militarily ready for war within 4 years. In a secret memorandum written in August 1936, Hitler was blunt about what this meant. The German army must be operational within 4 years, he wrote. The German economy must be fit for war within 4 years. The language was unambiguous. Germany was preparing for a specific conflict on a specific timetable. The 4-year plan directed massive investment into synthetic fuel production, synthetic rubber, iron ore extraction, and chemical industries, all the materials needed to fight a modern war, independent of imported supplies that an enemy blockade could cut off. Hermann Göring, appointed plenipotentiary for the plan, drove this industrialization with his characteristic energy and ruthlessness. But there was a fundamental problem that no plan could fully solve. Germany was a medium-sized European economy without the natural resources to sustain a prolonged major war. It lacked sufficient oil, iron, and food-producing agricultural land. The 4-year plan could reduce these deficiencies but not eliminate them. In the long run, Germany needed to acquire those resources by conquest, which was precisely what Hitler intended. The economics and the ideology pointed in exactly the same direction. By 1937, Germany's rearmament was creating real economic strain. The massive military spending was generating inflation and shortages of consumer goods. Workers were being shifted from industries producing food and clothing to factories making tanks and aircraft. The living standards of ordinary Germans, which had improved dramatically between 1933 and 1936 as the Depression lifted and employment rose, were beginning to stagnate. Some Nazi economists warned that the economy could not sustain the current pace of military spending for more than a few more years without either reducing the armament program or finding new resources through conquest. This economic pressure was not the primary reason Hitler decided to go to war when he did, but it was a significant factor in his thinking. Germany had committed itself to a military build-up it could not indefinitely. The clock was running. On November 5, 1937, Hitler called a secret meeting in the Reich Chancellery. Present were the commanders of the Wehrmacht's three branches, Field Marshal Werner von Blomberg as Minister of War, General Werner von Fritsch as Commander-in-Chief of the Army, Admiral Erich Raeder as Commander-in-Chief of the Navy, Hermann Göring as Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, and Konstantin von Neurath as Foreign Minister. Hitler's adjutant, Friedrich Hossbach, took notes on what was said. Those notes, recovered after the war and used as evidence at the Nuremberg trials, became known as the Hossbach Memorandum, and they are one of the most important documents in the history of the Second World War. In this meeting, Hitler was more explicit than he had ever been in an official setting about his intentions. He told his commanders that Germany's future was entirely dependent on solving the problem of space, meaning acquiring territory for the German people. This problem could only be solved by force. The question was when and how. Hitler outlined three scenarios, all leading to military action in Europe, the first two by 1943 to 1945 at the latest. He was strikingly specific about the time pressure he felt. After 1943 to 1945, he warned, Germany's relative military advantage would begin to erode. The Western powers were rearming. Britain and France were strengthening their forces. The window in which Germany's military edge over its potential enemies was at its maximum was not indefinite. It was, in Hitler's assessment, roughly the next 5 to 8 years, and the window was already shrinking. The Hossbach meeting provoked alarm among some of the men present. Blomberg and Fritsch raised objections. They worried that Germany was not ready for a war with Britain and France, that the armament program was not yet complete, that the risks were too great. Von Neurath was so disturbed that he suffered what his doctor described as a cardiac episode in the days following the meeting. These were not cowards. They were experienced military professionals who understood how wars were actually won and lost, and they were telling their Führer that his timetable was dangerously optimistic. Hitler heard their objections, and he removed them. Within 3 months, both Blomberg and Fritsch were gone from their positions, brought down through a combination of manufactured scandals orchestrated by the SS and Heinrich Himmler. Blomberg had committed the social crime of marrying a woman with a criminal record. Fritsch was falsely accused of homosexuality, a charge that was later proven to be a complete fabrication, but not before he had been forced out of command. In February 1938, Hitler used these crises to reorganize the entire command structure of the German military. He abolished the War Ministry and replaced it with the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the OKW, the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces, headed not by an independent military man, but by the completely loyal and entirely pliable Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel. Hitler himself became Supreme Commander of the German Armed Forces. The last institutional check on his military ambitions had been removed. From this point forward, the Wehrmacht would do what Hitler told it to do. This restructuring in early 1938 was a turning point that is sometimes overlooked in the wider narrative of how Germany reached war. But it was crucial. Hitler had just purged the senior military leadership of everyone likely to oppose him and placed himself at the apex of the military command structure. He had also, in February 1938, replaced Foreign Minister von Neurath with the Nazi hardliner Joachim von Ribbentrop, who would not raise inconvenient diplomatic objections to Hitler's plans. The diplomatic and military establishments had been brought firmly to heel. What happened next moved with the speed of a landslide. Just weeks after the military reorganization, Hitler turned his attention to Austria. The Anschluss, the union of Germany and Austria, had been a dream of German nationalists since the 19th century. Austria was a predominantly German-speaking nation. After the First World War, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire was dissolved, many Austrians had actually wanted to join Germany, but the peace treaties of 1919 had explicitly forbidden it. By early 1938, Hitler felt ready to resolve the Austrian question. Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg was summoned to Hitler's mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden on February 12, 1938, and subjected to hours of bullying, threats, and ultimatums. Hitler demanded that Schuschnigg appoint Austrian Nazis to key government positions and effectively surrender Austrian sovereignty. Schuschnigg, horrified, tried to find a way out. He announced a referendum on Austrian independence scheduled for March 13th. Hitler could not allow this referendum to proceed. If Austrians voted to remain independent, the bluff would be called. On March 11, 1938, German troops massed on the Austrian border, and an ultimatum was delivered. Schuschnigg must resign and hand power to the Austrian Nazi Arthur Seyss-Inquart, or Germany would invade. Schuschnigg resigned. The following morning, March 12, 1938, German troops crossed into Austria to what their commanders had expected to be opposition, but instead found flowers, cheering crowds, and almost universal jubilation from a population that genuinely did welcome union with Germany. On March 13, 1938, Austria was formally incorporated into the German Reich. The Anschluss was complete. The Western powers, Britain and France, expressed displeasure. Italy, which had previously positioned itself as a guarantor of Austrian independence, raised no objection because Mussolini had now tied himself to Hitler's chariot. The League of Nations did nothing. Once again, Hitler had moved boldly, achieved a massive strategic gain, and faced no consequences. Austria brought Germany 6 million additional people, significant industrial resources including the Steyr arms works and Austrian iron and steel industries, and a border with the Balkans that transformed Germany's strategic position in Central Europe. Perhaps most importantly, Austria eliminated Germany's southern flank and brought German territory to the border of Hungary and Yugoslavia, opening new avenues for future pressure. It was an enormous victory. And Hitler was not finished. Even before the Anschluss was complete, Hitler had identified his next objective: the Sudetenland, the border regions of Czechoslovakia, home to approximately 3 million ethnic Germans. Under the leadership of Konrad Henlein, a pro-Nazi Sudeten German politician, a political movement demanded autonomy for the Sudeten Germans within Czechoslovakia. In the spring and summer of 1938, Henlein's followers, directed and coordinated by Berlin, escalated their demands in ways deliberately designed to be impossible for the Czech government to meet. The strategy was transparent to informed observers, but effective against Western leaders desperate to avoid another war. Hitler encouraged Henlein's provocations while simultaneously preparing military plans. Case Green, the plan for the invasion of Czechoslovakia, was updated and refined through the summer of 1938. Hitler told his generals he was determined to smash Czechoslovakia by military action in the near future, as he put it in a directive issued on May 30, 1938. The generals were again alarmed. General Ludwig Beck circulated a series of memoranda arguing that an attack on Czechoslovakia would trigger a European war that Germany would lose. He resigned in August 1938 in protest, the most senior German officer to resist Hitler's plans through his resignation. His departure removed the last coherent voice of military caution from the army's command structure. What prevented the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1938 was not German reluctance, but the intervention of British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. Chamberlain was a man who had seen the horrors of the First World War from the home front, who had lost family members in that conflict, and who was absolutely determined that there should not be another such catastrophe. He believed, against increasing evidence, that Hitler was a rational statesman with whom reasonable accommodation was possible. He flew to Germany 3 times in September 1938 to negotiate with Hitler directly. At Berchtesgaden on September 15th, at Godesberg on September 22nd, and finally at Munich on September 29th and 30th, 1938, Chamberlain sought to find a compromise that would satisfy Hitler's demands without war. What he produced was the Munich Agreement. The Munich Agreement, signed on September 29th and 30th, 1938, was attended by Hitler, Mussolini, Chamberlain, and French Premier Édouard Daladier. Czechoslovakia itself was not invited to the conference that determined its fate. Under the terms of the agreement, Czechoslovakia was compelled to cede the Sudetenland to Germany immediately. In exchange, Germany and the other signatories guaranteed the independence of what remained of Czechoslovakia. Chamberlain flew home to Britain and announced to cheering crowds at Heston Airport that he had achieved peace for our time. He waved a paper bearing Hitler's signature. The crowds cheered. Many members of the British cabinet and parliament shared his relief. Winston Churchill, who had been warning about the Nazi threat for years and was largely ignored, spoke a darker truth when he told the House of Commons, "We have suffered a total and unmitigated defeat." Czechoslovakia, which had had a well-equipped army of 35 divisions and formidable border fortifications in the Sudetenland Mountains, had been abandoned by its supposed guarantors without firing a single shot. What would Munich mean for Hitler's calculations? For Hitler, Munich was both a triumph and, in a strange way, a disappointment. It was a triumph because he had achieved another massive strategic victory without firing a shot. The Sudetenland contained the industrial heartland of Czechoslovakia, including the famous Skoda Arms Works in Pilsen, one of the most productive armaments factories in Europe. German military forces were also now positioned along three sides of what remained of Czechoslovakia, which had become indefensible. But Munich was also a disappointment because Hitler had, in a sense, wanted a war. He had wanted to crush Czechoslovakia militarily as a demonstration of German power and as the opening move of his larger program of eastern expansion. The compromise arranged at Munich meant he had got what he claimed to want, but without the war, he had actually wanted. He complained bitterly afterward to his inner circle that Chamberlain had robbed him of his entry into Prague. This was not, as some historians have suggested, entirely irrational. Hitler understood something that Chamberlain did not, that every bloodless success made the next demand harder to sustain diplomatically, because at some point the Western powers would have to draw a line, and when they did, Germany would have to fight. Chamberlain's concessions at Munich had not bought peace. They had merely defined the terms under which the next confrontation would occur. That confrontation came sooner than most people expected. The remainder of Czechoslovakia, stripped of its border defences and its most industrially productive regions, was a state in name only. Slovak politicians were encouraged by Berlin to demand independence. The Czech rump state was subjected to constant German pressure. On March 14, 1939, Slovak leaders, prompted by Hitler, proclaimed Slovak independence. On March 15, 1939, German forces marched into Prague and occupied the rest of Bohemia and Moravia. What had been Czechoslovakia became the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, a German subject territory. Hungary occupied Carpatho-Ukraine. The country that had existed on September 28, 1938, when Chamberlain was negotiating at Munich, had ceased to exist in its entirety 6 months later. This was something fundamentally different from what had gone before. The annexations of Austria and the Sudetenland could at least be rationalized as uniting German-speaking peoples with Germany. The Czechs of Bohemia and Moravia were not German. They had not asked to join Germany. Their territory had been seized by brute force. The claim that Hitler was merely seeking to right the wrongs of Versailles and reunite the German folk was now exposed as the lie it had always been. The real game was conquest. And at this point, the calculations in London and Paris began to change. Chamberlain, deeply shaken and personally humiliated by Hitler's betrayal of the Munich guarantees, made a declaration in the House of Commons on March 17, 1939, that he was under no illusions about what Germany's actions meant. The policy of appeasement, already under severe criticism from Churchill and others, was effectively finished. On March 31, 1939, Britain and France issued formal guarantees of Polish independence. If Poland were attacked, Britain and France would come to its defence. This was a deliberate and dramatic reversal of British policy. For the first time, Britain was committing itself to a specific military obligation in Eastern Europe, something it had consistently refused to do throughout the Versailles period and the interwar years. How did Hitler react to this guarantee? Hitler reacted to the Anglo-French guarantee to Poland with a fury that, by the accounts of those present, bordered on hysteria. He raged at his aides, struck the table, and screamed that he would brew them a potion they would choke on. But once the initial outburst subsided, Hitler's thinking took a more calculating turn. The guarantee to Poland did not stop his planning for war against that country. It complicated it. It meant that an attack on Poland would almost certainly mean war with Britain and France, and that altered the entire strategic calculation in ways that required careful management. The question was not whether to attack Poland. In Hitler's mind, that decision was already made. Poland had to be destroyed. The question was how to do so without triggering a two-front war before Germany was ready to handle it. The answer to that question would arrive on August 23, 1939, in one of the most shocking diplomatic bombshells in modern history. But before we get to that moment, it is essential to understand exactly why Poland had become so urgent for Hitler in the spring and summer of 1939. Danzig, the predominantly German-speaking city at the mouth of the Vistula River, had been designated a free city under League of Nations supervision by the Treaty of Versailles, cutting it off from Germany. The Polish corridor, the strip of territory that separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany, was a daily humiliation in the German national consciousness. These were legitimate grievances in the sense that they reflected real demographic realities that the Versailles settlement had handled clumsily. But for Hitler, Danzig and the corridor were merely pretexts. What he actually wanted was not the return of Danzig. He wanted the destruction of the Polish state entirely and the acquisition of Polish territory as the first step toward the vast Eastern Empire he had dreamed of since writing Mein Kampf. Poland was in his way. Poland would have to be removed. In January 1939, Hitler had demanded that Polish Foreign Minister Joseph Beck come to Berlin to discuss the return of Danzig and the construction of an extraterritorial road across the Polish corridor connecting Germany with East Prussia. Beck refused. Poland would not surrender its Baltic access or compromise its sovereignty. That refusal sealed Poland's fate in Hitler's mind. If Poland would not negotiate, it would be compelled. To understand the full dimensions of why Hitler felt he had to move in 1939, we need to look closely at several converging pressures that were all pointing toward the same conclusion. The window for a successful German offensive was narrowing, and delay was not a neutral choice. It was a choice that would cost Germany its temporary military advantage. The first of these pressures was military. Germany's rearmament had given it a real edge over its potential enemies, but that edge was not permanent. Britain had begun serious rearmament in 1936, after a period of severe neglect. By 1936, the British government was spending £186 million on defence. By 1939, that figure had risen to £719 million. The Royal Air Force was being rebuilt with modern monoplane fighters and a sophisticated radar-based air defence system, the chain home network that would prove decisive in the Battle of Britain in 1940. The French army was enormous, with over 100 divisions and some of the finest artillery in the world, though its offensive doctrine was outdated. The Soviet Union was engaged in an ambitious and violent industrial transformation that was producing enormous quantities of tanks and aircraft, even as Stalin's purges of the Red Army Command were temporarily reducing its effectiveness. The longer Germany waited, the more these countries would close the military gap. German planners estimated that Britain's air rearmament alone would produce rough parity with the Luftwaffe by 1941 to 1942. After that, Britain's industrial advantage would make it progressively stronger relative to Germany. The second pressure was economic. The German war economy was showing real signs of stress by 1939. Consumer goods were scarce. Investment in civilian production had been systematically sacrificed to armaments. The Nazi economic miracle of 1933 to 1936, when unemployment was dramatically reduced and industrial output surged, had been achieved largely by deficit spending on the military. By 1939, the German national debt had ballooned to dangerous levels. Economist Adam Tooze, in his landmark study of the Nazi war economy, has demonstrated that Germany's financial position in 1939 was actually precarious. The foreign exchange reserves needed to import essential raw materials were nearly exhausted. Germany was dependent on imported oil, rubber, manganese, nickel, and a dozen other materials essential to modern warfare, and it was having increasing difficulty paying for them. The rearmament program that was supposed to make Germany invincible was simultaneously threatening to bankrupt the state. The only exit from this trap was conquest. Poland's agricultural resources, Czechoslovakia's already seized industrial base, and ultimately the oil fields of Romania and the vast mineral wealth of the Soviet Union were the prizes that would solve Germany's resource problem permanently. But to get them, Germany had to move before the financial and material position deteriorated to the point of genuine crisis. The third pressure was personal. Adolf Hitler was 50 years old in April 1939. He was not an old man by ordinary standards, but he was a man obsessed with his own mortality and with the conviction that he was a unique historical figure whose talents might not survive him. In private conversations throughout the late 1930s, recorded by his aides and later recovered, Hitler repeatedly expressed the belief that he alone had the qualities to lead Germany to its historical destiny, that no successor could be trusted to carry out what he had planned, and that his own health might not last indefinitely. He mentioned stomach problems, skin complaints, and a general deterioration that worried him. Some historians have suggested he was genuinely ill or feared he was. Others believe this was partly a rhetorical device to create urgency in his followers. But the effect was real. Hitler genuinely believed that if he didn't act in his own lifetime, the historical opportunity would be lost. He could not afford to wait. Speaking to his senior military commanders in a meeting on May 23, 1939, Hitler was unambiguous in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. He did not pretend that the dispute with Poland was primarily about Danzig. He told them plainly that the solution to Germany's problems required more space than could ever be obtained peacefully. Danzig was not the objective. The expansion of living space in the east was the objective. Danzig was a pretext. The attack on Poland would be just the beginning. There would be further conflict with Britain and France. The task was to isolate Poland and deal with it as quickly as possible, then turn west. The generals listened. Some were alarmed. Most understood that they had no choice but to plan for what their Führer had decided. Between May and August 1939, German military planning for the invasion of Poland was refined and finalized. The operational plan was called Fall Weiss, Case White. It called for a rapid assault from multiple directions simultaneously, using panzer forces to penetrate deep behind Polish defences, while infantry encircled and destroyed Polish units. The Luftwaffe would destroy the Polish Air Force in the opening hours and then provide close support to ground forces. The objective was to complete the destruction of the Polish army within weeks before any Western intervention could become effective on Polish soil. The plan was brilliant in conception, though it depended on the Poles being unable to mobilise their reserves fast enough and on the Western powers not moving immediately. General Franz Halder, who had replaced Beck as Chief of the Army General Staff, oversaw the planning process with his customary meticulous attention to detail. Halder was not enthusiastic about the war Hitler was planning, but he was a professional soldier who would do his duty. His diary from the summer of 1939 shows a man wrestling with private doubts but ultimately executing his orders to the letter. While the military planning proceeded, Hitler was also working on the diplomatic front, seeking to isolate Poland as completely as possible before the blow fell. The Anglo-French guarantee to Poland complicated matters, but it did not make them impossible. If Britain and France could be persuaded or manoeuvred into inaction once the war started, or if the campaign could be completed so quickly that their intervention came too late to matter, then the guarantee was manageable. What was not manageable was the prospect of a war on two fronts simultaneously, with Poland in the east and Britain and France in the west. That was precisely the nightmare scenario that had destroyed Germany in the First World War. The solution Hitler sought was audacious beyond anything his generals had dared imagine. He would make a pact with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin was, in ideological terms, Germany's most fundamental enemy. Hitler had spent 15 years portraying Bolshevism as the ultimate expression of Jewish domination, the ideological instrument through which world Jewry sought to destroy European civilization. The Soviet Union was the state Germany would have to conquer to acquire the Lebensraum its racial destiny required. A pact with Stalin seemed not merely incongruous, but ideologically obscene. Yet both Hitler and Stalin had powerful practical reasons to want exactly that. For Stalin, the calculation was relatively straightforward. Britain and France had abandoned Czechoslovakia at Munich. They had given Poland guarantees but shown no great enthusiasm for actually fighting Germany. Soviet attempts to negotiate a collective security arrangement with the Western powers in the spring and summer of 1939 had been conducted with suspicious half-heartedness on the British and French side. British negotiators sent to Moscow to explore an agreement with the Soviets arrived by slow boat rather than aircraft, a signal of the low priority London attached to the talks. Stalin concluded that the Western powers would be happy to see Germany and the Soviet Union destroy each other while they remained on the sidelines. A pact with Germany would keep the Soviet Union out of the immediate conflict, give it time to rebuild the Red Army after Stalin's purges had decimated its officer corps, and might deliver territorial gains in Eastern Europe as part of the deal. It was brutally cynical. It was also rational. For Hitler, the calculation was equally stark. A pact with the Soviet Union would neutralize the threat of a two-front war in the immediate term. It would prevent any Anglo-French-Soviet encirclement of Germany. It would secure German access to Soviet raw materials, including oil, grain, and metals, that would help solve the resource problem. And it would isolate Poland completely, since Poland's eastern flank would now be exposed to Soviet pressure as well. The ideological contradiction did not trouble Hitler much. He regarded the pact as a temporary expedient. Once he had dealt with Poland and, as he hoped, reached some accommodation with Britain and France in the West, he would turn on the Soviet Union and destroy it. The pact was not a reversal of his long-term intentions. It was a tactical maneuver designed to win the first act of his wars of conquest before the main act began. Negotiations between Germany and the Soviet Union proceeded at first through subtle diplomatic signals, and then, from late July 1939, with increasing urgency. The German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, a pompous former champagne salesman turned fervent Nazi who had somehow convinced himself that his diplomatic skills were superior, was tasked with concluding the agreement. Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, a cold and meticulous bureaucrat who had served Stalin through the purges and understood how to survive in the shark tank of Soviet politics, conducted the Soviet side. On August 23, 1939, Ribbentrop flew to Moscow. That evening, after several hours of negotiation in the Kremlin, he and Molotov signed what became known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, officially the Treaty of Non-Aggression between Germany and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The public clauses committed Germany and the Soviet Union to neutrality if either were attacked by a third party. The secret protocol that accompanied the pact was even more consequential. It divided Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and the eastern part of Poland were assigned to the Soviet sphere. Lithuania and the western part of Poland were assigned to the German sphere. In plain terms, Germany and the Soviet Union had agreed to partition Poland between them before either had fired a single shot. When news of the pact reached London and Paris on August 23rd, the effect was described by contemporaries as a thunderbolt. The possibility that Germany and the Soviet Union might reach an agreement had been contemplated by some observers, but the fact of it, announced without warning, threw Western calculations into disarray. Chamberlain's government spent frantic hours assessing what it meant. The conclusion was unavoidable. Germany was going to attack Poland very soon. The pact had removed the only factor that might have given Hitler significant pause. Poland now faced certain invasion. Britain and France faced the moment of truth. Would they honour their guarantee? In the days that followed, Chamberlain's government sent urgent messages to Berlin, reaffirming Britain's commitment to Poland, simultaneously attempting through back channels to find some last diplomatic exit. There was none. Hitler had no interest in a diplomatic exit. He had planned this moment for years. The Rubicon had been crossed the moment Ribbentrop signed his name in Moscow. In the final days of August 1939, the machinery of war ground into motion with the terrible inevitability of a mechanism that has been wound too tight and cannot be stopped. The German army, over 1.5 million men organised into more than 60 divisions, moved toward their jump-off positions along the Polish frontier. Wehrmacht officers who had known only peacetime service prepared for the first morning of their war. Luftwaffe crews were briefed on their targets, which included the Polish Air Force on its airfields, Warsaw's rail junctions, and the Polish military headquarters. The Kriegsmarine positioned its ships in the Baltic and North Sea. In Warsaw, Polish military commanders made their own preparations, knowing what was coming and knowing also that they were severely outmatched. Poland had fewer than 40 divisions that could be concentrated in time. No panzer forces, an air force of barely 500 aircraft of which many were obsolete, and strategic geography that was disastrous. Poland was surrounded on three sides by German-controlled territory after the annexation of Czechoslovakia. The country was an elongated target that could be struck simultaneously from the north, west, and south. Yet the Poles did not consider surrender. There was a quality of tragic heroism to Poland's position in August 1939 that has moved historians ever since. Poland's Foreign Minister Beck had refused Hitler's demands, knowing exactly what the refusal meant. The Polish people had a fierce tradition of resistance and a historical memory saturated with foreign invasion and occupation. They also had the Anglo-French guarantee. They believed, or had to believe, that Britain and France would respond swiftly and effectively to German aggression. That belief would prove to be partly founded on illusion, but it was the foundation on which Polish resistance was built. The Poles had been abandoned at Munich. They were determined not to be abandoned again without at least fighting. On the evening of August 31st, 1939, German SS troops in Polish uniforms staged an attack on the German radio station at Gliwice, a small border town in Silesia. This was Operation Himmler, a series of false flag incidents designed to provide Germany with a pretext for its invasion. The attackers broke into the radio station, broadcast a short message in Polish claiming that Poland was attacking Germany, and then left behind the body of a concentration camp prisoner dressed in Polish military uniform. This grim piece of theatre was one of several similar incidents staged along the German-Polish border that night. The following morning, Hitler stood before the Reichstag and announced that Germany had been attacked by Poland and was responding. The claim was transparently false. No one in the room believed it. No one outside Germany believed it either. But the ritual of the pretext had been performed. History would record that Germany had at least gone through the motions of justification. At 4:45 in the morning of September 1st, 1939, the German warship Schleswig-Holstein, which had arrived in Danzig harbour supposedly on a friendly visit, opened fire with its heavy guns on the Polish military depot on the Westerplatte Peninsula. Simultaneously, German land forces crossed the Polish frontier along its entire length. The Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War, had begun. German panzer columns punched through Polish defensive positions with a speed and violence that overwhelmed the defenders. The Luftwaffe caught much of the Polish Air Force on the ground in the first hours, and then turned its attention to bombing the road and rail lines along which Polish reserves were trying to move. Within hours, the shape of the campaign was clear. Poland was not going to be able to stop the German advance. The only question was how long it would take for the inevitable end to arrive. In London, Chamberlain's government faced its moment of decision. The guarantee to Poland had been made. The invasion of Poland was occurring. What would Britain do? For 2 agonising days, September 1st and September 2nd, the British cabinet debated while public opinion hardened and Parliament grew restless. There were those in the cabinet who still hoped some last-minute diplomatic solution could be found. Italy's Mussolini proposed an international conference. The idea was briefly considered and then abandoned when it became clear that Hitler had no interest in any conference that required him to give back Polish territory. In Parliament, Chamberlain's hesitant statement on the evening of September 2nd provoked an explosion of anger from members on all sides of the House. The mood was unmistakable. Britain had made a promise. It had to keep it. On the morning of September 3rd, 1939, the British government delivered an ultimatum to Berlin. Withdraw from Poland within 2 hours or Britain would consider itself at war with Germany. 2 hours passed with no response. At 11 o'clock in the morning of September 3rd, 1939, Chamberlain broadcast to the British nation. His voice carried the exhaustion and defeat of a man who had spent every effort to prevent this moment. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany. France issued its own declaration of war later that same day. What was Hitler's reaction when news reached him that Britain had declared war? Albert Speer, who was present in the Reich Chancellery that morning, described what he witnessed. When Ribbentrop brought him the news of Britain's declaration, Hitler sat in silence for a moment and then turned to his foreign minister and asked, "What now?" It was a revealing question. For all his bravado, Hitler had not expected Britain and France to actually fight. He had gambled on their capitulating once again, as they had at Munich, as they had at the Rhineland, as they had over Austria and Czechoslovakia. The guarantee to Poland had seemed to him like another piece of paper, another posture. He had been wrong. The world's largest empire and one of Europe's strongest military powers had just declared war on him, and he was not entirely sure what to do next. General Franz Halder wrote in his diary that Hitler appeared genuinely rattled. The military campaign against Poland was proceeding exactly as planned, But the wider war had begun in a way Hitler had not fully intended at this precise moment, with both Western powers engaged from the start rather than after he had first concluded the Polish campaign and made some kind of peace settlement in the West. Why did the Western powers not intervene more effectively to help Poland in September 1939? This question has haunted historical debate for decades. The simple answer is that they could not. France had mobilized a massive army along the Siegfried Line, Germany's western fortification belt, but French doctrine and political will combined to produce paralysis. There was no aggressive offensive. The French made some cautious probes into the Saarland that were quickly halted. The Royal Air Force dropped leaflets over Germany rather than bombs. The British Expeditionary Force began crossing to France but was not yet fully concentrated. The fundamental reality was that Britain and France had declared war but were not yet ready to fight it effectively. They had bought time for Poland at the cost of the guarantee, but the time they needed to translate their industrial and manpower potential into military effectiveness was time that Poland did not have. By September 17th, when the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east under the terms of the secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the military situation was already hopeless for Poland. Warsaw fell on September 27th. Polish resistance effectively ended on October 5th, 1939. The campaign had taken 35 days, so why did Germany have to start the Second World War in 1939 specifically? We have now traced all the major threads that converged to produce that moment. Let us weave them together. The first thread was ideological. Hitler had a program detailed in Mein Kampf and elaborated in countless private statements throughout the 1930s that required territorial conquest in the East. Poland was not an abstract irritant. It was the specific first obstacle on the path to the Lebensraum that his ideology demanded. Poland had to be destroyed. That was non-negotiable from his perspective. The only question was timing. The second thread was military. Germany had achieved a temporary military advantage over its neighbours through the massive rearmament program of 1933 to 1939. That advantage was real but not permanent. Britain, France, and the Soviet Union were all rearming. The German military window was at or near its maximum in 1939 and would begin to narrow thereafter. Waiting meant fighting a stronger coalition with worse odds. The third thread was economic. The German war economy, built on deficit spending and resource mobilization, was showing signs of unsustainable strain. The foreign exchange crisis, the shortage of raw materials, and the growing consumer discontent all pointed to a need for the military conquest that would provide the resources the economy could not otherwise obtain. Delay might mean economic crisis before the military program could deliver its promised results. The fourth thread was diplomatic. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had created a brief window in which the greatest threat to Germany's eastern flank, a hostile Soviet Union, had been neutralized. That window was temporary. Stalin was not a reliable partner, and Hitler knew it. The opportunity to fight a one-front war in the East with the Soviet Union neutralized and the Western powers hopefully deterred or at least unable to intervene effectively in time was a specific and fleeting diplomatic alignment that had to be exploited while it lasted. The fifth thread was personal. Hitler was 50 years old, convinced of his own unique historical destiny, concerned about his health and determined to carry out his program in his own lifetime. He had said repeatedly, in recorded conversations that survive in the historical record, that he was the only man capable of leading Germany to its destiny, and that he could not afford to wait for a successor to take up the work. Waiting was not an option his psychology permitted. The sixth thread was what might be called the logic of acceleration. Each step Hitler had taken since 1933 had produced success. The remilitarization of the Rhineland, the Anschluss, Munich, the occupation of Bohemia and Moravia, each crisis had been resolved in Germany's favour without the general war breaking out. Each success had encouraged Hitler to raise his ambitions and accelerate his timetable. But each success had also raised the stakes. After Munich, Britain and France had drawn a line at Poland. After the occupation of Prague, they had made that line explicit with guarantees. The game of expansion without war was approaching its limit. Either Germany would continue to expand and eventually fight, or it would stop and leave its program incomplete. For Hitler, stopping was not an option. His entire career had been built on the conviction that weakness invited destruction, and that only relentless forward motion could secure the future he envisioned for Germany. So, the war had to come. And 1939 was the moment when the military window, the economic pressure, the diplomatic opportunity, and Hitler's personal urgency all converged. One more dimension deserves attention before we leave this question, and that is the question of what kind of war Hitler actually thought he was starting in September 1939. The evidence strongly suggests that Hitler did not intend to fight Britain and France in September 1939. His plan, insofar as it can be reconstructed from his statements and decisions, was to attack Poland so rapidly that the campaign would be complete before Britain and France could intervene effectively, then to offer the Western powers some form of accommodation that would end their state of war with Germany without them having suffered serious losses or having had to fight seriously. He had consistently underestimated British resolve and misjudged the degree to which British public opinion had hardened after Munich and Prague. He thought the Anglo-French declarations of war were political gestures that would not be followed by real military action once Poland was gone. He was correct that Britain and France did not fight effectively to save Poland. He was wrong that they would accept a fait accompli and make peace. They stayed in the war. And that decision by Chamberlain's government, and then Churchill's, transformed what Hitler had imagined as a limited regional conflict into the total war that eventually destroyed his regime and killed tens of millions of people. The men who carried out Hitler's war in September 1939 were a fascinating collection of professional soldiers, ideological warriors, and calculating opportunists, each of whom had his own reasons for being where he was when the guns began to fire. Understanding their stories helps illuminate not just the mechanics of how Germany went to war, but the human dimensions of the catastrophe. These were the commanders, planners and architects of the war that Hitler had decided was necessary, and that a whole generation of German officers had spent the 1930s preparing themselves to fight. Walter von Brauchitsch, the commander-in-chief of the German army when the war began, had risen to the apex of the military hierarchy through a combination of genuine competence and careful political navigation. Born in 1881 into a family with deep Prussian military traditions, Brauchitsch had served with distinction in the First World War and remained in the reduced Reichswehr throughout the Weimar years, steadily building his reputation as an able administrator and strategic thinker. By 1938, when Hitler appointed him as commander-in-chief of the army following the Blomberg-Fritsch affair, Brauchitsch had already demonstrated that he understood how to work with the Nazi regime without openly challenging its authority. His appointment came with an uncomfortable price. Hitler personally provided financial assistance to help Brauchitsch pay for his costly divorce and remarriage, a transaction that left the general personally indebted to his Führer and unwilling to oppose him on major questions. When Brauchitsch attended the Hossbach meeting in November 1937 and heard Hitler's war plans, he had been one of those who voiced concerns. By 1939, those concerns had been swallowed by the reality of his position. He was commander-in-chief of the German army, and his Führer had decided to go to war. Brauchitsch organised, planned and executed accordingly. His role in the Polish campaign was to oversee the operational execution of Case White, and in this capacity he performed his duties with professional competence. The campaign in Poland was a genuine military masterpiece in its conception and execution, if a political and moral catastrophe in its broader context. German panzer columns under generals like Heinz Guderian and Erich von Manstein moved with unprecedented speed, creating the encirclements that trapped and destroyed Polish formations before they could retreat or reconstitute themselves. But Brauchitzsch's relationship with Hitler deteriorated throughout the war. He was unable to control Hitler's increasingly direct interference in military operations, most disastrously during the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. The failure of Operation Typhoon, the assault on Moscow that stalled in the Russian winter of 1941, broke Brauchitsch. He suffered a heart attack in November 1941 and was dismissed by Hitler in December of that year, never to hold another command. He spent the remainder of the war in a forced retirement at his estate, watching from the sidelines as the conflict he had helped launch consumed Germany. British forces arrested him in August 1945 on charges of war crimes. He was held in custody for 3 years awaiting trial, but on October 18, 1948, he died of pneumonia before he could be brought before a court. The man who had commanded Hitler's armies on the opening day of the Second World War would never have to answer in a courtroom for what those armies had done. Franz Halder, the chief of the Army General Staff during the Polish campaign, was a very different kind of man from Brauchitsch. Where Brauchitsch was smooth and accommodating, Halder was meticulous, precise, and privately tortured by what he was helping to plan. Born in 1884 in Würzburg into a long line of Bavarian military officers, Halder had served in the First World War as a staff officer and had developed into one of the finest military planners of his generation. He was deeply professional in the German General Staff tradition, which meant he was trained to analyze operational problems with rigorous objectivity and to provide his superiors with the best possible military advice, regardless of whether they wanted to hear it. When General Ludwig Beck resigned as Chief of the Army General Staff in August 1938 in protest against Hitler's plans for war, Halder was appointed as his successor. It was a promotion that came attached to a moral compromise that Halder never entirely resolved. Halder's private diary, which he kept throughout the war and which survived to become one of the most valuable historical documents of the period, reveals a man in permanent internal conflict. He recorded Hitler's directives and the operational planning in meticulous detail. He also recorded his own doubts and fears with surprising candor for a man in his position. In late 1938, Halder had actually made contact with members of the German military resistance and had even, according to some accounts, discussed the possibility of a coup against Hitler if war seemed inevitable. These discussions came to nothing when the Munich Agreement seemed to have defused the crisis. After Munich, the moment had passed. The coup that might have prevented the war was never executed. And Halder continued his work, planning first the campaigns against Poland and France, then against the Soviet Union, always with the professional precision of his training and the private anguish of a man who understood exactly where the road led. He was dismissed by Hitler in September 1942 after increasingly bitter disagreements over the conduct of the Russian campaign, and he was later arrested by the Gestapo after the July 1944 assassination attempt on Hitler, though he was not directly involved. He survived the war in concentration camp custody, was liberated by American forces in 1945, and went on to cooperate extensively with the American military history program, providing his analysis of German operations. He passed away in Aschau im Chiemgau, Bavaria, in April 1972 at the age of 87, having outlived almost all his contemporaries from those catastrophic years. Heinz Guderian, the general most directly associated with the Blitzkrieg concept and the panzer forces that made it possible, was in many ways the perfect embodiment of the offensive military doctrine that made Germany's early war campaigns so spectacularly successful. Born in 1888 in Kulm, West Prussia, Guderian was the son of a Prussian officer and followed his father into the military as a matter of natural vocation. He served in the First World War in communications roles that gave him an unusual appreciation for the importance of information flow and coordination in modern battle. In the interwar years, while Germany was officially forbidden from developing armoured forces, Guderian studied tank warfare theory intensively, reading British theorists like J.F.C. Fuller and Basil Liddell Hart, and developing his own vision of what armoured warfare could achieve. He became convinced that tanks should not be parcelled out to support infantry, as was conventional doctrine, but concentrated in independent armoured formations capable of driving deep into enemy territory, bypassing strong points, disrupting command and communication networks, and creating the psychological as well as physical shock that would cause enemy armies to collapse. This was Blitzkrieg theory in its essence. When Hitler came to power and rearmament began in earnest, Guderian found himself in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. His ideas were controversial among more conservative generals, but they found an enthusiastic champion in Hitler himself, who instinctively understood the dramatic and decisive qualities of armoured warfare, and who welcomed the aggressive, offensive spirit Guderian embodied. Guderian rose rapidly through the Panzer Command structure, and by the time of the Polish campaign he commanded the 19th Corps, one of the most powerful armoured formations Germany possessed. His corps punched through Polish defences with a speed that astonished even those who had planned for rapid operations, reaching objectives that defensive-minded planners had assigned 3 to 4 times as many days to achieve. The Polish campaign confirmed everything Guderian had theorized, and it set the stage for the even more spectacular French campaign of 1940, in which his panzer group drove through the Ardennes and reached the Channel coast, cutting off the British Expeditionary Force and the bulk of the French army in what remains one of the most daring and devastating military maneuvers in history. After the war, Guderian was briefly held as a prisoner of war, released in 1948 without trial, and wrote his famous memoirs, Panzer Leader, which became one of the definitive accounts of armoured warfare in the Second World War. He passed away in May 1954 at Schwangau in Bavaria, regarded by military historians as one of the most original military minds of the 20th century. Erich von Manstein was another officer whose genius for operational planning was central to Germany's early war success. Born in 1887 in Berlin as Erich von Lewinsky, he was adopted by his mother's brother, General Georg von Manstein, and took his adoptive family's name. He served in the First World War and remained in the Reichswehr throughout the Weimar years, steadily building his reputation as one of the most analytically gifted staff officers of his generation. By the time of the Polish campaign of 1939, Manstein was serving as Chief of Staff to Army Group South under General Gerd von Rundstedt, and he played a significant role in planning the southern thrust into Poland that contributed to the rapid encirclement and destruction of Polish forces. But Manstein's real moment of genius came in the planning of the French campaign of 1940. When the original German plan for the attack on France, which envisioned a relatively straightforward replay of the 1914 Schlieffen Plan, was presented to the senior command, Manstein saw its weaknesses immediately. He proposed instead the bold Sichelschnitt plan, the sickle cut, which would concentrate the main armoured effort through the Ardennes forest, which French planners had assumed was impassable to large armoured formations, and drive to the Channel coast behind the Allied armies in Belgium. It was this plan, initially rejected by the Army General Staff but brought to Hitler's attention and enthusiastically adopted, that produced the devastating campaign of May and June 1940. Manstein was captured by the British in 1945 and tried for war crimes related to his commands on the Eastern Front. While acquitted of the most serious charges, he was convicted on lesser counts and served several years in prison before being released due to health problems in 1953. He later served as a military advisor to the West German government and published his memoirs, which remain essential reading for students of military history. He died in 1973 in Irschenhausen, Bavaria. Gerd von Rundstedt, arguably the most senior and prestigious of the German field commanders who fought in Poland, was already 64 years old when the war began. He had retired from active service in 1938 as a colonel general and was recalled specifically for the Polish campaign to command Army Group South, the southern pincer of the German attack. Rundstedt was the grand old man of the German army, a product of the Wilhelmina military tradition with an aristocratic bearing and a sardonic wit that made him simultaneously respected and feared. His military judgment was considered by many of his peers to be the finest in the German officer corps, and his personal courage was beyond question. Yet Rundstedt had his share of moral compromises. He had witnessed and not prevented atrocities on the Eastern Front, and had signed or transmitted orders that contributed to war crimes. After the war, British forces arrested him in May 1945. He suffered a heart attack during his interrogation. Charges relating to war crimes were prepared, but Rundstedt's age and failing health made prosecution increasingly impractical. He was released in July 1948 without trial and lived out his remaining years in Schloss Oppershausen in Lower Saxony, troubled by heart conditions. He died on February 24, 1953, at the age of 77. The man who had commanded the opening assault of Germany's most consequential war died in a West German castle, never having faced a court of law. Wilhelm Keitel, who as chief of the OKW, the High Command of the German Armed Forces, was the senior military figure subordinate to Hitler throughout the war, represents a very different kind of story from the field commanders. Keitel was not a battlefield commander. He was an administrator, a coordinator, a loyal and efficient servant of his Führer's will. Born in 1882 in Helmscherode in Lower Saxony, Keitel had a conventional military career through the First World War and the interwar years, rising through staff positions without particular distinction as an operational thinker. What Keitel had was administrative competence and, crucially, a psychological need to please his superiors that made him extraordinarily useful to Hitler. He said yes. He transmitted orders. He never challenged, never objected in any effective way, never interposed his own judgment between Hitler's commands and their execution. His colleagues in the German officer corps privately despised him for this. They called him Lackey-Tell, a pun on lakai, meaning lackey, and Keitel his name. He was Hitler's rubber stamp, and the orders he transmitted included some of the most criminal of the entire war. Orders for the execution of Soviet commissars, orders for the mistreatment of prisoners of war, orders that contributed directly to the deaths of millions of people. Unlike many of his peers, Keitel faced justice directly. He was arrested by British forces in May 1945, tried at Nuremberg before the International Military Tribunal, and found guilty on all 4 counts: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, planning and waging wars of aggression, war crimes and crimes against humanity. Unlike the more senior Brauchitsch, who died before trial, and unlike some others who escaped prosecution, Keitel faced the full force of international justice. He was hanged in Nuremberg on October 16, 1946, alongside his fellow criminal Alfred Jodl. Before the hangman came, he was asked if he had any last words. He said, "I call on God Almighty to have mercy on the German people. More than 2 million German soldiers went to their death for the fatherland before me. I follow now my sons." It was a statement that revealed, even at the very end, a man incapable of genuine reflection on the crimes to which he had been complicit. Alfred Jodl, who served as Chief of Operations in the OKW throughout the war, was in many ways the intellectual counterpart to Keitel's administrative loyalty. Jodl was genuinely brilliant as a military planner, a master of operational detail and strategic analysis. Born in 1890 in Würzburg, he had distinguished himself as an artillerist in the First World War and developed through the interwar years into one of the finest operational minds in the German army. In the OKW, he was responsible for translating Hitler's often grandiose and sometimes contradictory strategic visions into concrete operational plans. This required both intellectual acuity and a willingness to serve a master whose judgment was often deeply flawed. Jodl provided the acuity. He also provided the willingness, and it was this willingness that made him complicit in the worst crimes of the regime. He signed off on the Commissar Order, which mandated the summary execution of captured Soviet political officers. He participated in decisions that condemned millions of prisoners of war to death by starvation and exposure. He was the professional brain behind an army conducting a war of annihilation. At Nuremberg, Jodl's defense was that he was a soldier following orders in a legitimate chain of command. The tribunal rejected this argument. He was found guilty on all 4 counts and hanged alongside Keitel on October 16, 1946. His last words, spoken in German, were, "I salute you, my eternal Germany." In Bavaria, after his death, a denazification court posthumously found him not guilty, a decision overturned by a Bavarian administrative court in 1953. The controversy over his legacy continued for decades, reflecting the deeper German struggle to understand what guilt and responsibility meant for men who had been professional soldiers in a criminal regime. The question of what the German generals thought they were doing in 1939 is one that historians have examined from every angle. The standard defense that many of them offered in their memoirs and at their trials was that they were professional soldiers following the orders of a legitimate government, that they had no authority over political decisions, and that the crimes committed in the course of the war were either unknown to them or carried out by others, specifically the SS and the security apparatus, over which they had no control. This defense was partly valid and mostly evasion. It was valid in the limited sense that the German officer corps had indeed been shaped by a tradition of political neutrality, of leaving political decisions to civilians and carrying out whatever military tasks the government required. It was evasion in the more important sense that the war they were fighting was so clearly criminal in its conception and execution that the claim of ignorance or powerlessness strains credibility beyond its breaking point. They had read Mein Kampf. They had attended the Hossbach meeting or received its conclusions through official channels. They had transmitted orders for the mistreatment of prisoners and the killing of civilians. They had watched the SS operate in territories under their command. Some had protested privately. Almost none had resigned in protest or actively resisted in a way that carried real personal risk. They had calculated that cooperation was better than resistance, and they had made that calculation over and over again as each new outrage was committed in the name of the Germany they served. There were exceptions. Ludwig Beck, as we have seen, did resign. Henning von Treschow, who served on the Eastern Front and became increasingly convinced that the war was a crime, joined the military resistance and was involved in multiple attempts to assassinate Hitler, most famously placing a bomb on Hitler's aircraft in March 1943. When the bomb failed to detonate, Treschow recovered it without detection and continued planning. He was involved in the July 20th, 1944 assassination attempt, the most nearly successful of all the plots against Hitler's life. When that attempt also failed and arrests began, Treschow walked out into no man's land on the Eastern Front and detonated a grenade. He died not because he was caught, but because he understood that his capture under Gestapo interrogation would endanger others. His final words, recorded by an aide, expressed his conviction that what they had done to resist the Nazi regime would matter even in failure, because it would prove that not all Germans had submitted to evil without resistance. Treschow's story is an essential counterweight to the comfortable narrative that the German officer corps had no choice but to comply. There were men who chose otherwise. They were exceptional. That they were exceptional is itself the tragedy. The broader question of how a nation of 80 million educated, industrially advanced, and culturally sophisticated people came to support or tolerate or at least not effectively resist a regime that committed the crimes of the Third Reich has occupied sociologists, psychologists, historians and philosophers for 8 decades and is nowhere near resolved. Several factors deserve particular emphasis in answering it. The first is the reality of the Nazi terror state, which made open dissent extraordinarily dangerous. Concentration camps had existed since 1933. The Gestapo maintained a vast network of informers that extended into factories, apartment blocks and family dinner tables. People knew what happened to those who spoke too loudly against the regime. Fear was a genuine and powerful constraint on behavior, but fear alone does not explain everything. The Nazi regime also had genuine popular support, particularly in its early years when it was delivering on its promises of economic recovery, national revitalization, and the dismantling of the hated Versailles system. Millions of Germans genuinely supported Hitler. Many more felt a kind of reluctant admiration, or at least an admission that the man was getting things done. Anti-Semitism, while not universally intense, was widespread enough that the persecution of Jews provoked relatively little organized protest from the general population. The combination of terror, genuine support, and the moral anesthesia produced by years of propaganda made the Nazi regime extraordinarily resistant to internal challenge. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935, which stripped Jews of German citizenship and forbade marriage or sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews, were one expression of the racial ideology that permeated every aspect of the Nazi system. By 1939, Jews had been systematically excluded from economic and professional life, their property seized or sold under compulsion at a fraction of its value, and their options for remaining in Germany had been reduced to near zero. The Kristallnacht pogrom of November 1938, in which Jewish synagogues, businesses and homes across Germany were attacked and destroyed while the police stood aside, had shown clearly that the regime's anti-Semitism was not merely rhetorical. About 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps in the aftermath of Kristallnacht. The message was unmistakable. Yet even after all of this, the full horror of what the Nazi regime would do to the Jewish people of Europe still lay ahead. The systematic murder that became the Holocaust was not yet underway in September 1939. It developed and accelerated as the war progressed, particularly after the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. But the ideology that made it possible was fully formed before the war began. It was written into the Versailles of the Nazi mind. The invasion of Poland itself was accompanied from the very first days by atrocities against the civilian population. SS Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units, followed the German army into Poland with orders to liquidate the Polish intellectual, political, and religious leadership. Thousands of Polish teachers, priests, professors, lawyers, doctors, and local politicians were rounded up and shot in what the Nazis called Action AB, an extraordinary pacification action. The purpose was to destroy Polish society's capacity for organized resistance by eliminating its leaders. General Johannes Blaskowitz, who commanded Army Group South after the main campaign phase, submitted formal protests about these atrocities to the Army High Command and to Hitler personally. He was troubled by the murders and by the effect they were having on military discipline. His complaints produced no changes in policy. They did produce damage to his career. Hitler regarded his protests as evidence of childish attitudes and old-fashioned military sentimentality. Blaskowitz was passed over for promotion and eventually sidelined, though he continued to serve in various commands until the end of the war. His courage in protesting was real. Its effectiveness was nil. And that gap between moral protest and effective action was the defining feature of the German officer corps' experience of the regime throughout the war. Hans Frank, who was appointed Governor-General of occupied Poland in October 1939, administered what became one of the most brutally exploited territories in human history. Frank was not a military man. He was a lawyer who had served as Hitler's personal legal advisor and had been one of the early members of the Nazi Party. As Governor-General, he oversaw the systematic plunder of Poland's economic resources, the brutal exploitation of its population for forced labor, and eventually the organization of the deportation and murder of Poland's Jewish population. Frank's court at Wawel Castle in Krakow was a bizarre parody of aristocratic culture, with elaborate dinners, art collections stolen from Polish institutions, and the formal trappings of governance imposed on a subject population being systematically destroyed. He was tried at Nuremberg after the war and hanged on October 16, 1946. Unlike some of his peers, Frank showed what appeared to be genuine remorse in his final years. He converted to Catholicism, publicly repented his crimes, and described his time as Governor-General as a period of moral depravity from which he had been unable to escape. His son, Nicholas Frank, born in 1939, grew up to become one of the most vocal German public figures in confronting and condemning his father's crimes, writing extensively about the Holocaust and the legacy of Nazi perpetrators. His willingness to denounce rather than defend his father's actions placed him in a very different category from figures like Gudrun Himmler, who remained loyal to her father Heinrich Himmler's memory until her own death in 2018. The German military's relationship with the SS and the broader apparatus of Nazi terror in Poland set precedents that would become catastrophically worse in the Soviet Union 2 years later. The Wehrmacht did not simply look the other way while the SS committed atrocities. In many cases, army units participated directly in mass killings, provided logistical support for the Einsatzgruppen, and enforced discriminatory orders against civilian populations. The fiction of a clean Wehrmacht, a professional military that fought an honourable war while the criminals of the SS committed their crimes separately and independently, was exactly that, a fiction. It was a fiction constructed after the war by surviving generals in their memoirs and at their trials, and it was a fiction that served their obvious interest in avoiding accountability. The Wehrmacht and the SS were not separate worlds. They were parts of the same murderous enterprise directed by the same political leadership, serving the same ideological program. One of the figures who exemplified the connection between military command and the machinery of occupation was Ernst von Weizsäcker, the State Secretary of the German Foreign Ministry in 1939. Weizsäcker was a diplomat of the old school, uncomfortable with many aspects of the Nazi regime, and in private correspondence he had expressed reservations about the direction of German policy. But he remained in his position and continued to serve, arguing to himself and to others that his presence moderated the regime's worst impulses. The historian's verdict on this argument has generally been harsh. By remaining in place and lending his professional competence and legitimacy to the Nazi Foreign Ministry, Weizsäcker helped it function more effectively than it otherwise might have. His career exemplifies the tragedy of the German professional class during the Nazi period, too compromised to resist, too decent to be entirely comfortable, too self-interested to sacrifice position for principle. The question of what alternatives existed to the war that began on September 1, 1939, is one that historians continue to debate. Was there a point at which a different set of decisions by anyone, German, British, French, or Soviet, could have prevented the catastrophe? Some have argued that a firmer Allied stance at the Rhineland in 1936, backed by the threat of military force, might have deterred Hitler or even brought down his regime, since his military advisors had told him they could not resist a French countermove. Others point to Munich, arguing that the Anglo-French concessions there removed the last effective brake on Hitler's ambitions and made war inevitable. Still others focus on the failure to reach a timely collective security agreement with the Soviet Union in 1939, arguing that if Britain and France had taken Soviet approaches more seriously in the spring of 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact might have been prevented, and Germany might have faced the prospect of the dreaded two-front war from the start, deterring the attack on Poland. These are all plausible arguments, and none of them are beyond historical dispute. What they share is the recognition that the outcome was not predetermined. History does not run on rails. The catastrophe of September 1939 was the result of specific decisions made by specific people at specific moments, and different decisions at any of several junctures might have produced different outcomes. This does not diminish the responsibility of those who made the actual decisions. Hitler chose to seek war. His generals chose to plan it. The Western powers chose to appease rather than confront until it was too late for appeasement to work. Stalin chose to make his pact with the devil. Each choice was made by a human being with options, operating under constraints but not under compulsion, and the cumulative weight of all those choices produced the morning of September 1st, 1939, when the guns began to fire on the Westerplatte and the world changed forever. The Polish soldiers who resisted the German invasion for 35 days, fighting against overwhelming odds with courage that earned even the grudging admiration of their enemies, deserve to be remembered not just as victims, but as the first combatants in a war that ultimately destroyed the regime that attacked them. The Westerplatte garrison, 180 Polish soldiers defending the military transit depot against bombardment from the Schleswig-Holstein and assault by German infantry, held out for 7 days before finally surrendering on September 7th under conditions honourable enough that the German commander saluted the Polish officers as they came out. The Polish cavalry, armed with lances and sabres but also with modern anti-tank rifles, fought engagements that the Nazi propaganda machine deliberately distorted into images of horsemen charging tanks. A myth designed to make the Poles look primitive and heroic and tragic all at once. The Polish Air Force, though outnumbered, shot down significant numbers of German aircraft in the campaign and did not simply collapse on the first day as German commanders had hoped. Poland fought, and although it lost, it did not surrender. Its government continued to exist in exile in London throughout the war. Polish soldiers fought on every front, from the Battle of Britain in the air to Monte Cassino in Italy to the liberation of Western Europe. Poland's resistance to Nazi Germany was one of the defining moral facts of the Second World War. The civilians of Poland, particularly the Jewish population of about 3.3 million, which constituted roughly 10% of Poland's entire population, faced something even more terrible than military defeat. Within months of the German occupation, the process of ghettoization and economic strangulation that would eventually lead to mass murder had begun. The Warsaw Ghetto, established in October 1940, became the largest Jewish ghetto in occupied Europe, eventually confining nearly 500,000 people in an area of just over 3 square kilometres. The conditions, as starvation rations, disease and deliberate brutality were applied, killed tens of thousands before the systematic deportations to the extermination camps began in 1942. By the end of the war, approximately 90% of Poland's pre-war Jewish population, roughly 3 million people, had been murdered. The German decision to go to war in 1939 was also a decision, made in consequence of all the ideological commitments that war carried, to murder the Jewish people of Europe, not immediately, not all at once, but inexorably, as the logic of racial war unfolded in the territories Germany conquered. The immediate aftermath of the Polish campaign in October 1939 revealed something important about the nature of the war Germany had started. Hitler made peace overtures to Britain and France, proposing that since Poland was finished, there was no reason for the Western powers to continue the conflict. Chamberlain's government rejected these overtures. Churchill, who had joined the War Cabinet as First Lord of the Admiralty on the day war was declared, was a powerful voice against any negotiated peace. France was equally uninterested. The war went on. The strange period that followed, from October 1939 to April 1940, became known as the Phony War or Sitzkrieg, the Sitting War. The two sides faced each other along the Franco-German border with no major offensives, each waiting for the other to move first. For Germany, this pause was used to wrest the panzer forces from Poland and to plan the next campaign. For Britain and France, it was used to build up supplies, train troops, and argue amongst themselves about strategy. Neither side was truly ready for the kind of war they would soon be fighting. It was during this period that the implications of what Germany had set in motion became clearer to those willing to see them. The economic question that had partly driven Germany to war in 1939 was not resolved by the conquest of Poland. Poland's agricultural resources helped, and the plunder of Polish industry, art, and movable wealth was considerable. But Germany still needed oil, and the oil of Romania and the Caucasus still lay beyond its reach. The naval blockade that Britain had immediately imposed on Germany was squeezing its access to overseas raw materials, just as it had in the First World War. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact provided a partial solution. Soviet deliveries of grain, oil, and other raw materials flowed westward in exchange for German-manufactured goods and military equipment. But this arrangement was temporary and depended entirely on Soviet goodwill, which was itself conditional on Germany not threatening Soviet interests too directly. Hitler knew he would eventually have to break the pact. The question was, when? The senior figures of the Nazi regime who were most closely involved in the economic management of the war found themselves navigating impossible contradictions. Hermann Göring, as plenipotentiary for the four-year plan, was simultaneously running the Luftwaffe and trying to manage an economy that was being asked to produce ever-increasing quantities of military equipment, while also maintaining the consumer goods supply that kept the German home front supportive of the war. These objectives were fundamentally in tension. Göring was not an economist. He was a political operator who had acquired his economic authority through his closeness to Hitler, rather than any expertise in industrial management. His preferred method of problem-solving was to bully factory managers into higher production while raiding the economies of occupied territories for anything of value. This approach worked in the short term and created structural problems in the medium and long term that would eventually contribute to Germany's economic collapse. Göring's personal lifestyle during the war years lived in ostentatious luxury at Karinhall, his vast estate north of Berlin, decorated with stolen artwork from across occupied Europe, hunting parties conducted on a grand scale, a wardrobe of bizarre and flamboyant uniforms of his own design, represented a kind of moral dissociation from the reality of the war being fought in his name. Albert Speer, Hitler's personal architect who had designed the monumental buildings and the vast rallying grounds that gave the Nazi regime its theatrical grandeur, took over as armaments minister in February 1942 following the death of Fritz Todt. Speer was the one genuinely effective manager in the senior levels of the Nazi regime. He rationalized armaments production, reduced waste and duplication, created a coherent system for allocating raw materials across competing demands, and dramatically increased German military production even as Allied bombing campaigns intensified. Between 1942 and 1944, German armaments output tripled, a remarkable achievement that significantly prolonged the war by giving Germany the military capacity to keep fighting long after its strategic position had become hopeless. Speer achieved this largely through the brutal exploitation of forced labour, drawing on millions of workers from across occupied Europe, prisoners of war, concentration camp inmates and civilians conscripted in conditions that amounted to enslavement. Speer later claimed at Nuremberg that he had not known about the Holocaust or the full extent of the crimes being committed in the labour system he managed. This claim was received with considerable scepticism by the tribunal and has been largely demolished by subsequent historical research. He was convicted and sentenced to 20 years in Spandau prison, the most lenient sentence of any of the senior defendants who were not acquitted entirely. He served his full sentence and was released in 1966, then spent his remaining years writing memoirs and giving interviews in which he carefully managed his image as the good Nazi, the apolitical technocrat who had served an evil regime without fully sharing its ideology. He died in London in 1981. The wider war that Germany had started in September 1939, the war that spread from Poland to include Western Europe, North Africa, the Balkans, the Soviet Union, and eventually the entire globe, transformed the nature of human conflict in ways that are still being understood 8 decades later. The Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939 to 1941 redefined the possibilities of offensive warfare. The air war over Britain in the summer and autumn of 1940 demonstrated both the potential and the limits of strategic air power. The German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, Operation Barbarossa, was the largest military operation in human history, involving over 3 million German and Axis soldiers attacking a front of nearly 3,000 kilometres. It was also the beginning of the most murderous phase of the war, in which the ideological content of Hitler's program became fully visible in all its horror. The Einsatzgruppen that had operated in Poland were given expanded mandates in the Soviet Union. By the end of 1941, they had murdered an estimated 500,000 Jews and tens of thousands of Soviet officials, prisoners of war, and civilians in mass shootings across the occupied territories. The systematic murder of Europe's Jews, the Holocaust, escalated from this foundation of mass shooting to the industrial processes of extermination at camps including Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, and Majdanek, ultimately claiming approximately 6 million Jewish lives and an equal or greater number of non-Jewish victims, including Soviet prisoners of war, Poles, Roma, the disabled, homosexuals, and political opponents. This industrialized murder was the most extreme expression of the ideology that had driven Germany to war in 1939. But it was connected to that ideology by an unbroken thread. Hitler had said in January 1939, in a speech to the Reichstag, that if the international Jewish financiers succeeded in plunging the nations of Europe into another world war, the result would be the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. This prophecy, which he repeated and referenced throughout the war, is one of the most explicit statements of genocidal intent by any political leader in recorded history. He had not yet decided exactly how or when or through what mechanism the murder would be carried out. But the intent was there, waiting for the conditions that war would create. When the war came, when the occupied territories of Eastern Europe placed millions of Jews under German control, when the military campaigns generated both the brutality and the administrative infrastructure that made mass murder possible, the intent became operational. The decision for genocide grew out of the war. The war grew out of the ideology. The ideology had been there from the beginning. Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS who presided over the entire apparatus of persecution and murder, was perhaps the most bureaucratically efficient mass murderer in history. Born in 1900 in Munich, the son of a Bavarian schoolteacher, Himmler was an unlikely architect of genocide. He had studied agronomy at a technical college, tried and failed to establish himself as a poultry farmer, and drifted into the Nazi movement in the early 1920s. His organisational talents and fanatical ideological commitment brought him rapidly to prominence. By 1929, he commanded the SS, which at that time numbered only 280 men. By 1939, it had grown into a vast empire of security police, concentration camp guards, racial bureaucrats, and armed formations. Himmler managed this empire with meticulous attention to administrative detail and an extraordinary capacity for compartmentalizing the human consequences of what he was doing. He oversaw the murders of millions while maintaining a family life in Munich, expressing sentimental fondness for his daughter Gudrun and writing letters about the proper cultivation of medicinal herbs. This dissociation between the ordinary surface of his life and the monstrous reality of his work was in many ways the most disturbing thing about him. More disturbing than open sadism would have been, because it demonstrated how ordinary human psychology could accommodate extraordinary evil when ideology provided the necessary framework. Himmler was captured by British forces after the German surrender in May 1945, having shed his SS uniform and disguised himself as a minor police official. His deception was discovered, and as he was being examined by a British medical officer on May 23, 1945, he bit down on a cyanide capsule hidden in his gums and died almost immediately. He thus avoided the Nuremberg tribunal that sentenced so many of his subordinates. His daughter Gudrun, who had been devoted to him throughout her life and had visited him in his SS headquarters as a child, refused to accept the historical verdict on her father. She remained a convinced supporter of his legacy until her own death in 2018, working throughout her life with the Stille Hilfe organization that provided support to former SS members and their families. The contrast between Gudrun Himmler's determined loyalty and the searing condemnation offered by figures like Nicholas Frank about his own father, Hans Frank, illustrated the range of responses that the children of perpetrators brought to the impossible legacy they had inherited. Reinhard Heydrich, who served under Himmler as the chief of the Reich Security Main Office, was in some ways an even more frightening figure than Himmler, because to his administrative talent he added genuine intelligence, physical courage, and a capacity for strategic thinking. Born in 1904 in Halle, Heydrich had served briefly in the Navy before being dismissed and joining the SS. He rose rapidly through Himmler's organization and became the driving force behind some of the most extreme elements of Nazi policy. He chaired the Wannsee Conference of January 1942, the meeting at which senior Nazi officials coordinated the administrative machinery for the systematic murder of European Jews. He was appointed Reichsprotector of Bohemia and Moravia, the former Czechoslovakia that Germany had occupied in March 1939, and his brutal administration of that territory earned him the nickname the Butcher of Prague. In May 1942, he was attacked in his open car by two SOE-trained Czech resistance fighters, Jan Kubiš and Josef Gabčík, who had parachuted into Bohemia specifically to kill him. The bomb they threw seriously wounded him, and he died of his injuries on June 4, 1942. The German reprisal was ferocious. The village of Lidis was destroyed, its male inhabitants shot, its women sent to concentration camps, and its children either murdered or distributed to German families. Thousands of Czechs were executed or imprisoned in the weeks following Heydrich's death. His wife Lena survived the war and spent decades in legal battles with the West German government over her pension entitlements, eventually securing a substantial settlement. She wrote a memoir titled Life with a War Criminal, which attempted to defend Heydrich's reputation, and died in Finland in 1985. The Nuremberg trials, which began in November 1945 and continued through 1946, were a landmark attempt to hold the architects of the war and its accompanying crimes accountable under international law. The concept was revolutionary and its execution was imperfect, but its significance cannot be overstated. For the first time, leaders of a defeated nation were tried not merely for the traditional war crime of military misconduct, but for crimes against peace, which included planning and waging wars of aggression. This charge was directly relevant to the question we have been examining throughout this video: why Germany had to start the Second World War in 1939. At Nuremberg, the prosecution argued that the Nazi leadership had deliberately conspired to commit crimes against peace, that they had planned and executed wars of aggression in violation of international law, and that this planning was itself a criminal act for which individuals could be held personally responsible. This argument, which drew on the Keelock-Briand Pact of 1928 that had formally outlawed aggressive war as an instrument of national policy, established a principle that has shaped international law ever since. Of the original 22 defendants at the main Nuremberg trial, 12 were sentenced to death, 7 received prison sentences ranging from 10 years to life, 3 were acquitted, and 2 were not tried, one having committed suicide before the trial began, and another having been declared medically unfit to stand trial. Among those hanged were Göring, Ribbentrop, Keitel, Jodl, Rosenberg, Frank, Frick, Streicher, Sauckel, Seyss-Inquart, and Bormann in absentia. Göring, characteristically, managed to evade the noose by obtaining a cyanide capsule, probably smuggled in by a sympathizer among the American prison staff, and killing himself the night before the scheduled executions. His death cheated the gallows but did not diminish the historical verdict. Among those who received prison sentences was Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy Führer until 1941, who was sentenced to life imprisonment. Hess had flown solo to Scotland in May 1941, in what he apparently believed was a genuine mission to negotiate peace with Britain, a mission that served only to demonstrate how detached from reality the upper reaches of the Nazi leadership had become. He was held in Spandau prison for the rest of his life, the last inmate of that institution after the others had served their sentences or died, and he committed suicide there on August 17, 1987, at the age of 93. His wife, Ilse, who had been interned briefly after the war and then released, spent the post-war decades advocating for his release, opening a boarding house in Allgäu to support herself and maintaining her belief in National Socialism until her own death in 1995. Karl Dönitz, who had commanded Germany's U-boat fleet during the war and had briefly succeeded Hitler as head of state in the final days, was tried at Nuremberg and found guilty of 2 of the 4 charges against him: war crimes and crimes against peace. He was acquitted of crimes against humanity. His sentence of 10 years in Spandau prison was considered lenient by many observers, and it was partly the result of a successful defense argument that Allied naval forces had conducted unrestricted submarine warfare in the Pacific, making it difficult to convict Dönitz for doing the same in the Atlantic without a degree of legal hypocrisy. He served his full 10-year sentence and was released from Spandau in October 1956, relocating to a small town near Hamburg. He published his autobiography, Memoirs 10 Years and 20 Days, in 1958, in which he claimed to have had no knowledge of Hitler's crimes, a claim received with considerable skepticism. He died in December 1980 after a prolonged illness, the last of the Nuremberg defendants to die. Albert Kesselring, who had commanded German air and ground forces in the Mediterranean and Italian theatres with considerable tactical skill, earning the nickname Smiling Albert for his affable manner even in crisis, was not tried at Nuremberg, but faced a separate British military tribunal in Venice in 1947. He was found guilty of ordering the execution of 335 Italian civilian hostages in the Ardeatine Caves massacre of March 1944, carried out as retaliation for a partisan attack that had killed 33 German soldiers. He was sentenced to death, but his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. He was released from prison in 1952 due to declining health and subsequently became involved in numerous veterans associations, offering his views on military strategy and German rearmament. He died in Bad Nauheim in July 1960. Erich von Manstein, widely regarded as the most gifted operational commander in the German army, was captured by the British in 1945 and tried before a British military tribunal in Hamburg in 1949 on charges including unlawful transfer of populations and failing to protect civilian populations. He was convicted on 9 of the 17 charges and sentenced to 18 years in prison, but his sentence was reduced on appeal, and he was released in May 1953 after serving barely 4 years. He subsequently served as a military advisor to the West German government as it established the Bundeswehr, and wrote 2 volumes of memoirs that are still studied in military academies around the world. He died in June 1973 in Irschenhausen in Bavaria. His reputation among military historians as a genius of operational warfare has proved remarkably durable, though the moral questions surrounding his command of forces that committed atrocities on the Eastern Front have received increasing attention in more recent scholarship. Georg von Küchler, who had commanded the 18th Army in Poland and later Army Group North on the Eastern Front, faced justice more directly than many of his peers. He was tried in the High Command Trial, one of the Nuremberg successor trials conducted by an American tribunal in 1948. The evidence presented at his trial revealed the extent of his involvement in atrocities, including the murder of mentally disabled individuals in occupied Soviet territory and the brutal treatment of prisoners of war. Despite his attempts during the proceedings to attribute the conditions in prisoner of war camps primarily to winter weather, which he described as an act of God rather than a consequence of deliberate policy, the court found him guilty. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, a sentence reduced to 12 years in 1951. He was released from Landsberg prison in February 1953 and lived out his remaining years in Garmisch-Partenkirchen in Bavaria, dying there on May 25, 1968. Maximilian von Weichs, who had commanded Army Group B during the invasion of Yugoslavia and later commanded all German forces in the Balkans, faced a different outcome from the legal process. He was scheduled to stand trial in the hostages trial, another of the Nuremberg successor proceedings which examined German reprisal killings of civilians in the Balkans. However, Weichs was removed from the proceedings before sentencing on medical grounds, a decision that effectively allowed him to escape prosecution despite his alleged involvement in the brutal anti-partisan campaigns that had cost the lives of tens of thousands of civilians in Yugoslavia and Greece. He died in Bonn on September 27, 1954, at the age of 72, never having faced a court judgment for his wartime actions. His case exemplified the imperfect and in some respects deeply unsatisfying nature of post-war justice for senior German commanders, where health, age, and the practical limitations of the legal proceedings allowed some of the most culpable individuals to escape accountability. Wilhelm List, who had commanded the invasion forces in the Balkans in 1941 and had been one of the German commanders most directly responsible for the brutal reprisal policies in Yugoslavia and Greece, was tried in the hostages trial. He was sentenced to life imprisonment in 1948, but was released from custody in December 1952 due to ill health. It was one of the more striking ironies of the post-war justice process that List was released on health grounds and then proceeded to live for another 19 years, dying on August 17, 1971, at the age of 91 in Garmisch-Partenkirchen. His post-war longevity stood in pointed contrast to the hundreds of thousands of civilians who had died under German occupation policies he had authorized. Paul Ludwig Ewald von Kleist, who had commanded the 1st Panzer Group in the spectacular breakthrough at Sedan during the French campaign of 1940 and then led some of the largest armoured operations of the war on the Eastern Front, met a darker fate than most of his peers. He was handed over to Yugoslavia by the British after the war and sentenced to 15 years in prison for war crimes committed during the Balkans campaigns. He was then extradited to the Soviet Union, where he was tried for war crimes related to his commands on the Eastern Front and sentenced to 25 years in a correctional labour camp. Unlike many of his fellow commanders who survived their imprisonment, Kleist died in Soviet custody on November 13, 1954, of heart failure while imprisoned at Vladimir Central Prison, east of Moscow. His death in Soviet captivity made him one of the highest-ranking German officers to die in Soviet hands, a fate that reflected both the specific crimes committed by German forces under his command in the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union's determination to extract accountability from the men who had led the invasion of its territory. The process by which post-war Germany came to terms with the crimes committed in its name was long, painful, and profoundly incomplete. The denazification program imposed by the Allied occupation authorities after 1945 sorted millions of Germans into categories from major offenders to mere followers, with financial penalties and employment restrictions applied according to the category. The process was widely regarded by both Germans and Allied officials as inadequate from the start. The sheer number of people involved and the practical impossibility of conducting meaningful legal proceedings against millions of individuals meant that most people who had actively supported or participated in the Nazi regime faced at most minor consequences. Many former Nazi Party members rebuilt successful careers in the Federal Republic's civil service, judiciary, business community, and political life. The first West German Chancellor, Konrad Adenauer, himself a man of genuine democratic and anti-Nazi credentials who had survived the Nazi period through a combination of courage and careful withdrawal from public life, was well aware that his government contained former Nazis and quietly accepted this as the price of governing a country where almost no adult had entirely clean hands. The Waffen-SS veterans who had fought as the elite military units of the Nazi regime faced a particularly contentious process of post-war reintegration. Their legal status was complicated. At Nuremberg, the International Military Tribunal had declared the SS as a whole, including the Waffen-SS, to be a criminal organization, meaning that membership could itself constitute a criminal act. But in practice, the vast majority of Waffen-SS veterans received only limited or no punishment. The lower-ranking soldiers, particularly those conscripted after 1943, were generally released from prisoner of war camps by 1946 and 1947, with their records marked, but their lives intact. A minority of higher-ranking officers faced military tribunals, including SS Brigade Führer Kurt Meyer of the 12th SS Panzer Division, who was convicted of atrocities in France and Belgium and served several years in Canadian and West German custody before being released in 1954. By 1953, Chancellor Adenauer had effectively normalized the Waffen-SS veterans by declaring that they had fought as soldiers like any other, a statement that carried enormous political weight in a country where veteran organizations were a significant voting bloc. The Mutual Aid Association of former Waffen-SS members, founded in 1951 and known as HIAG, became a powerful lobby group that worked to rehabilitate the Waffen-SS's historical image and secure pension rights for its veterans. HIAG's central argument, that the Waffen-SS had been an apolitical fighting force with no special connection to the regime's crimes, was historically indefensible but politically effective for decades. The organization finally dissolved in 1992 under the pressure of changing German attitudes and the revelation of its extensive revisionist activities. The legacy of September 1, 1939 extends into every corner of the modern world. The United Nations, founded in 1945, was explicitly designed to prevent the kind of state aggression that Germany had committed, with the Security Council's collective security mechanism meant to do what the League of Nations had failed to do. The Nuremberg Principles established the legal framework for international criminal justice that eventually produced the International Criminal Court, established in 2002. The NATO alliance, founded in 1949, was built specifically to deter the kind of hegemonic aggression by a single European power that Germany had pursued, and its founding members included the explicit recognition that the appeasement strategies of the 1930s had been catastrophically mistaken. The European project, which began with the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951 and eventually evolved into the European Union, was rooted in the conviction that binding European nations together economically and politically would prevent the rivalries and resentments that had produced 2 world wars in 30 years. All of these institutions were direct responses to the war that began on September 1, 1939. The memory of September 1939 also shaped the policy of every subsequent generation of leaders confronted with aggression. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990, the international response was partly framed in terms of the lessons of Munich, of what happens when aggression is appeased rather than confronted. When NATO intervened in the Balkans in the 1990s, the spectre of how Europe had stood by while aggression and genocide unfolded in the 1930s was explicitly invoked. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the parallels with German aggression in the late 1930s, specifically the use of ethnic minority populations as a pretext for territorial annexation and the argument that historic territorial claims justified present military action, were immediately and extensively drawn. History does not repeat itself in exact forms, but it provides patterns that those who study it carefully can recognize. The pattern of 1939 has proved particularly durable. Germany itself underwent one of the most remarkable transformations in modern political history in the decades after 1945. From the nation that had started the most destructive war in human history, Germany became one of the most committed advocates of international law, multilateral institutions, and peaceful conflict resolution. This transformation was not automatic or complete. It involved decades of difficult historical reckoning, political struggle, and generational change. The Historikerstreit, the historians' dispute of the 1980s, saw German academics debate how to understand and represent the Nazi past, with some arguing for a more relativized view and others insisting on the specific and exceptional character of Nazi crimes. The Goldhagen debate of the 1990s, sparked by Daniel Goldhagen's book Hitler's Willing Executioners, raised difficult questions about the degree of ordinary German complicity in the Holocaust. The opening of new archives after German reunification in 1990 and after the fall of the Soviet Union produced waves of new scholarship that consistently pushed the understanding of German guilt and complicity deeper and wider. By the early 21st century, Germany had established one of the most extensive systems of Holocaust education, memorial culture, and legal prohibition of Nazi symbols in the world, including mandatory education about the Holocaust in schools and criminal penalties for Holocaust denial. This did not mean that the problem was solved or that German society was immune to the far-right movements that have grown across Europe in recent decades. But it did represent a serious and sustained attempt to confront the most terrible chapter in a nation's history. What, then, is the ultimate answer to the question we posed at the beginning of this video? Why did Germany have to start the Second World War in 1939? The answer is complex, but it resolves into a core argument. Germany had to start the war in 1939 because the combination of ideological compulsion, economic pressure, military opportunity, and personal urgency created a specific convergence in that year that made war in Hitler's mind not merely desirable, but necessary. The ideology demanded Lebensraum in the East, and that could only be obtained through war. The economy, strained by 6 years of massive deficit spending on armaments, required the conquest of resources that could not be obtained peacefully. The military window, the period in which Germany had a genuine advantage over its potential enemies, was at its maximum in 1939 and would narrow thereafter as Britain, France, and the Soviet Union completed their own rearmament programs. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact created a specific and temporary diplomatic environment in which Germany could fight without immediately facing a two-front war. And Hitler, 50 years old, convinced of his own historical destiny and increasingly concerned about his own mortality, was not willing to wait for a better moment that might never come. None of this was inevitable in the deeper sense of being determined by forces beyond human control. At multiple points, different decisions by different people could have produced different outcomes. If the German officer corps had translated its private reservations about Hitler's plans into effective resistance rather than compliance, the war might not have started when it did, or might not have started at all. If Britain and France had confronted Hitler's aggression at the Rhineland in 1936 with military force rather than diplomatic protest, his regime might have collapsed under the resulting humiliation. If the Western powers had engaged the Soviet Union in genuine collective security negotiations in 1938 and 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact might never have been signed. If Chamberlain had treated the Munich Agreement as the last possible concession rather than as a precedent for further appeasement, Hitler might have faced a harder choice. But these are the what-ifs of history, the paths not taken. What was taken was the path that led to September 1st, 1939, and everything that followed. The U-boats that Karl Dönitz dispatched into the Atlantic after the declaration of war, the panzer columns that Guderian drove across Polish plains, the bombers that the Luftwaffe sent against Polish cities, the SS Einsatzgruppen that followed in the Wehrmacht's wake to begin the systematic murder of Poland's intellectual and racial communities, all of these were instruments of a war that had been in preparation for 6 years, rooted in an ideology that had been developing for much longer, driven by pressures economic and military and personal that had converged in that specific autumn of 1939 with a force sufficient to drag the entire world into catastrophe. Understanding why requires understanding not just the final trigger, not just the crisis over Danzig or the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, but the entire chain of causation that runs back through Munich and the Rhineland and the 4-year plan, and the Hossbach Memorandum, and the seizure of power in 1933, and the Great Depression, and the Weimar Republic and Versailles, and the stab-in-the-back myth all the way to the moment in November 1918, when a corporal in a field hospital in Passewalk heard that Germany had surrendered and formed the burning, murderous conviction that someone had to pay for what had been done. That corporal was Adolf Hitler, and his conviction became the War of 1939, and the War of 1939 became the defining catastrophe of the 20th century. The 6 years of warfare that followed September 1st, 1939, produced casualties that the human mind struggles to fully comprehend. Somewhere between 70 and 85 million people died as a result of the Second World War, making it the deadliest conflict in human history by an enormous margin. The Soviet Union alone lost between 26 and 27 million people. Poland lost roughly 6 million citizens, half of them Jewish. Germany itself lost between 6 and 8 million people, military and civilian. China, where the war had begun earlier with Japanese aggression in the 1930s, lost perhaps 14 to 20 million. No corner of the inhabited world was entirely untouched. The war that Hitler had decided was necessary to fulfill Germany's historical destiny consumed not just Germany's enemies, but Germany itself, leaving its cities in ruins, its territory divided between East and West, and its national identity shadowed by a guilt that 3 generations of Germans have struggled to process. When the war ended in May 1945 with Germany's unconditional surrender, the Nazi leaders who had planned and executed the war of 1939 faced a variety of fates. Some were hanged at Nuremberg, some died in prison, some escaped justice through death, illness, or the imperfect reach of the legal proceedings. Some, like Manstein and Kleist and Küchler, served portions of their sentences and lived out quiet retirements in West German towns. A minority, aided by the Odessa network and sympathetic organizations, escaped to South America, the Middle East, or other destinations where they rebuilt lives under assumed names. Some were eventually tracked down by Israeli intelligence or other agencies. Some died in obscurity. The diversity of their post-war fates reflected both the genuine moral complexity of some individual cases and the practical limitations of post-war justice in an era when millions of people had participated in a criminal regime in ways that ranged from the directly murderous to the merely complicit. What none of them could escape was the historical record. the documentary evidence of what Germany had done, the orders issued, the reports filed, the bureaucratic machinery of genocide and conquest survived in vast quantities in captured German archives. The Nuremberg prosecutors had access to millions of documents. The historians who followed them have had access to even more. The story of why Germany went to war in 1939, told through those documents and through the accounts of survivors and witnesses and participants on all sides, has been told and retold in thousands of books, documentaries, academic articles, and memorial institutions. It remains one of the most studied, analysed, and debated events in human history. And it remains relevant, not as a curiosity of the past, but as a continuing warning about the forces that can drive a modern state toward catastrophic aggression and the decisions, or the failure to make decisions, that allow those forces to prevail. Well, that is it for today. Thank you so much for watching. We hope this video gave you a deeper understanding of one of history's most consequential questions: why Germany had to start the Second World War in 1939. The answer, as we have seen, lies not in a single decision or a single moment, but in the convergence of ideology, economics, military calculation, diplomatic opportunity, and personal obsession across the entire decade of the 1930s. If you enjoyed learning about today's topic, make sure to check out our video about what happened to Germany's field marshals after World War II, where we explore the diverse fates of the men who commanded Hitler's armies in the war that began on that September morning. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content. See you in the next one.